A temporary city built in 1904 St. Louis changed how real estate, labor, and urban growth worked, and those effects didn't disappear when the fair ended. St. Louis in 1904 was already a major city, the second or third largest in America, depending on how you counted. But it wasn't New York, it wasn't Boston. It was Midwestern industrial growing, but not yet the kind of place people talked about as a cultural destination. Then the city decided to host the World's Fair, and in doing so, it accidentally wrote the playbook for how temporary events reshape the permanent economy of a place. Here's the claim: the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair didn't just entertain people for one summer. It permanently increased property values, created a permanent labor market shift, and left behind infrastructure that shaped where wealthy people chose to live and work for decades. Let's walk through the evidence. Exhibit 1: the sheer scale of the physical footprint. The fair occupied over 200 acres in Forest Park. That's roughly the size of 900 football fields. To put that in perspective, that's not a small pop-up. This wasn't a weekend carnival. This was a temporary city with its own electricity grid, water system, streets, and thousands of buildings. Building all of that required hiring contractors, laborers, architects, and engineers. St. Louis's construction workforce nearly doubled in 1902 and 1903. But here's where the permanent impact starts. Those workers, they needed somewhere to live. They needed to rent apartments, buy groceries, ride trolleys. Landlords saw demand spike, so they started building more housing closer to Forest Park. Property values in neighborhoods adjacent to the fairgrounds, places like Clayton and University City, started climbing years before the fair even opened. Exhibit 2: the permanent infrastructure left behind. When the fair closed in December 1904, most of the temporary buildings were torn down, but not everything. The city invested in permanent utilities, roads, and transit connections to serve those 20 million visitors. That infrastructure didn't evaporate, it stayed, and it made Forest Park and the surrounding neighborhoods more accessible and more valuable than before. Think of it like this: imagine you live on a quiet street with no direct highway access. Your property is worth, say, $100,000. Then the city builds a highway exit right next to your neighborhood because of a temporary event. Even after the event ends, that highway is still there. Your property is now worth $150,000. The infrastructure doesn't leave. Exhibit 3: the reputation shift. Before 1904, St. Louis was known for riverboats and manufacturing. After hosting the World's Fair, it became known as a city that could host world-class events. That matters for business. Companies considering where to locate a branch office think about whether a city can attract talent, whether it has culture, whether it's a place people want to move to. The fair put St. Louis on the national map in a way that manufacturing data never could. It showed the world that St. Louis wasn't just a grimy industrial town. It was a place of ambition, innovation, and culture. That's not a tangible asset like a building, but it changed how people thought about where to invest money and where to move their families. Exhibit 4: the labor market that never left. During the fair, St. Louis needed thousands of temporary workers, construction crews, maintenance staff, food service, security. Some of those workers were from out of town, but many were local, and after the fair, many of them stayed. Why? Because the fair had proven that St. Louis could support a larger workforce. Businesses expanded, new companies moved in. The job market was bigger than it had been before. This is the economic multiplier effect. You hire 10,000 construction workers. They spend their paychecks at local shops. The shops hire more staff. The staff spends money on rent. Landlords collect rent and invest it elsewhere. The effect ripples outward. When the temporary jobs disappeared after the fair, the permanent jobs and spending patterns that had been created didn't disappear with them. Exhibit 5: the demographic shift. Before the fair, St. Louis's wealthy residents were concentrated in certain neighborhoods. The fair and the infrastructure built to support it created a new desirable area. Wealthy families started moving to neighborhoods closer to Forest Park, especially to the west and south. This wasn't random. It was driven by the new accessibility and prestige those areas had gained from the fair. Property values followed the people. Neighborhoods that had been middle class became upper middle class. Upper middle class neighborhoods became wealthy. And that pattern, where people chose to live based on proximity to a cultural landmark and new infrastructure, became the template for how St. Louis developed for the next 50 years. Now here's what makes this interesting from an economic standpoint. The World's Fair was temporary. The economic effects were permanent. The fair lasted about 7 months, but the infrastructure, the reputation, the labor market expansion, the property value changes, those all outlasted the fair by decades. Some of them still shape St. Louis today. This matters because it shows us something that's easy to forget. Temporary events can have permanent economic consequences. The money spent during the fair, the wages, the construction costs, the visitor spending was temporary. But the infrastructure, the job creation, the reputation, and the property value changes that resulted from that spending were not. It's similar to how an Olympic Games or a major sporting event affects a city today. The event itself is temporary, but the stadium remains. The transit improvements remain. The increased brand recognition remains. The businesses that open to serve visitors, some of them stick around. The workers who move to the city, some of them stay. The investors who saw growth potential, they keep investing. St. Louis's 1904 World's Fair proved that a temporary spike in activity could create permanent changes in real estate prices, labor demand, and urban development patterns. The fair was the spark, but the infrastructure, the reputation, and the economic momentum it created, those were the lasting fire. And that fire changed the shape of the city for generations. So the claim stands, the 1904 World's Fair didn't just entertain St. Louis. It permanently increased property values, created sustainable labor demand, and shaped where people chose to live and invest for decades. A temporary city left a permanent mark on a metropolis's economic future. Understanding how temporary events reshape permanent economies helps explain why cities compete so fiercely to host major events today, and why the costs and benefits of those events matter so much. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden economic forces shaping our cities and neighborhoods. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice.